They said her court was made of music and fire. In the high vaulted halls of Aquitaine, where torches painted gold across the carved beams and the air smelled of beeswax and wine, Eleanor walked like a flame among stone. Men whispered that she was born with a crown already in her blood, that her smile could disarm princes and her silence could unmake kings. Once, poets called her the brightest jewel of Christendom, yet what history would remember was not her beauty or her songs, but the way she raised a boy who became a storm. Eleanor had inherited Aquitaine as a girl of 15, an empire in miniature, stretching across the sun-drenched south of what is now France, richer and more cultured than the gray northern realms that eyed it with envy. The troubadours flourished in her court, weaving tales of courtly love, loyalty, and daring, while stone keeps rose above vineyards and rivers, where Roman roads still cut straight and sure. In this world of elegance, Eleanor learned that power could be cloaked in silk, but must be grasped like steel. She was clever, restless, and utterly unwilling to be ruled. At first, she thought she might conquer the world with charm alone. She married Louis VII, King of France, and at 16 became queen. But Louis was pious and cautious, a monk in a crown, and their temperaments clashed like flint and water. When she followed him on the Second Crusade, she rode at the head of her vassals in gleaming armor, scandalizing Europe. In the dust and disaster of Antioch, she quarreled openly with him. By the time they returned, their union had rotted beyond repair. They had 2 daughters but no sons, and in 1152, the Pope granted an annulment. Eleanor slipped the chains of the French crown and emerged free again, wealthier than most kings and dangerous. Within 8 weeks, she had married Henry, Duke of Normandy and heir to the throne of England, a man 11 years her junior, burning with energy and ambition. Together they forged the Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, a dominion so vast it seemed to defy the order of the world. If Louis had been cold stone, Henry was molten iron. Their marriage was a tempest, passion and brilliance tangled with suspicion and rage. They produced 8 children, and among them, Eleanor saw one who was hers in spirit. The 3rd son, born at Oxford in 1157, with bright eyes and a will already sharp. They named him Richard. As Henry carved power across his territories, Eleanor returned to Aquitaine with her little boy. She raised Richard not in the gray drizzle of England, but in the blazing courts of the South, where music braided with politics and knights measured worth not only in battle, but in poetry. The boy absorbed this world like wine into cloth. He grew tall and quick, riding ponies before his legs reached the stirrups, reciting troubadour verses, watching the ritual pageantry of tournaments. Yet beneath the pageantry, Eleanor whispered the truth she had learned too young, that crowns were never given, only taken, and that loyalty was a language men spoke until ambition taught them another. He was her chosen heir, though not the eldest. She saw in him a fire she recognized from her own veins, and she intended to shape it before Henry could smother it. But Henry was not a man to yield sons to anyone's design. He believed in grinding down resistance like a whetstone sharpens a blade. To him, Eleanor's domain was a jewel to be swallowed into his empire, and her children were pieces to be moved on his chessboard. He kept her increasingly at arm's length, roaming from castle to castle in a frenzy of governance. While she anchored Aquitaine, she felt him watching Richard, measuring him, plotting how to tame him. She felt her son's pride flare whenever Henry's shadow crossed his path. It was a dangerous pride, and it thrilled her. By adolescence, Richard was already Lord of Men. Henry granted him the ducal title of Aquitaine in 1172, thinking it would tether the boy to his will. Instead, it set Richard loose. He rode through his duchy in gleaming mail, waging savage campaigns against rebel barons who defied him. At 16, he commanded sieges like a seasoned captain, hurling stones from trebuchets into the towers of castles older than Rome's memory. He showed mercy when it served him, brutality when it did not. The people called him the lion's cub, half in awe, half in fear. Eleanor watched from her courts, proud and uneasy, for she saw how swiftly he embraced the sword. But beneath their rising splendor, the Angevin world was fracturing. Henry's empire was a patchwork held together by his relentless motion, and he played his sons against one another to keep them too divided to overthrow him. Eleanor saw this clearly and saw the trap yawning beneath her children's feet. The eldest, Henry the young king, had been crowned co-king in a hollow ceremony, but wielded no real power. His resentment simmered. Geoffrey schemed in Brittany. John, the youngest, Henry's darling, grew spoiled and cunning. And Richard stood proud, neither loyal nor rebellious yet, a blade still waiting to choose which way it would cut. Eleanor feared what Henry's manipulations would force him to become. In 1173, the fire finally caught. The young king rebelled against Henry, and Richard joined him. Eleanor, tired of being sidelined, secretly threw her weight behind her sons, sending messages, urging Aquitaine to rise. For a moment, the dream glimmered. Henry might fall, and Richard might rise, and Eleanor might at last be the architect of her own dynasty. But Henry's will proved stronger. He crushed the revolt with merciless speed. The young king fled, Geoffrey submitted, and Richard, just 15, knelt before his father's wrath. Eleanor was captured while attempting to flee and carried away under guard. Henry locked her in cold stone chambers, where she would remain for 15 years, a queen in chains. For Richard, the defeat was searing. He had gambled and lost, and now the father he had defied watched him like a hawk. Henry spared him but forced him to bend the knee and return to ruling Aquitaine as a vassal duke. Yet in the shadows of his humiliation, something hardened. He threw himself into crushing the barons who had betrayed him, storming their fortresses, tearing down their banners, grinding their resistance to dust. If he could not yet break Henry, he would make himself unbreakable. And as he burned his way across Aquitaine, he carried the image of his mother behind every thought. The woman who had taught him to dare, now caged because she dared too much. In her prison, Eleanor received fragments of news, dispatches from loyal clerks, rumors in the whispers of ladies-in-waiting who dared speak her name. She read of Richard's campaigns with a strange ache, pride tangled with dread. The boy she had cradled now ruled like a thunderstorm. She wondered if her captivity had freed him from the last softness in him, if the price of his greatness was the breaking of his gentler self. In the long silences of her confinement, she pressed her palm to the cold stone walls and thought of the songs once sung in her halls, and of how she had given birth to a lion. By the late 1170s, Richard's fame had outgrown Aquitaine. Troubadours sang of his courage, his brilliant command in battle, his fearlessness in the press of combat. They did not sing of how he had learned to mask his loneliness with fury, or how he dreamed of a world where he did not have to bow to a father who feared his strength. Eleanor knew, though. She knew because she had once been that child herself, born to rule yet caged by men who thought crowns their birthright. She had escaped her cage and forged an empire. Now she waited in her prison, watching from afar as her son, her lion, stalked the edges of his own. In the torch-lit corridors of Henry's castles, the old king walked like a man pursued by ghosts, though he would never have admitted it. He had caged the mother, but the son was sharpening his claws. And Eleanor, trapped yet unbroken, whispered to the stones around her that the world had not heard the last of her. Far from her cold cell, Richard trained, plotted, and rose, and the storm she had sown in secret began to gather on the horizon. The rebellion had ended like a storm-striking stone, violent, deafening, and then suddenly gone, leaving only silence and ruin. In 1174, the Angevin world lay shattered in the wake of its own children. Henry II, bloodied but unbroken, had crushed his son's revolt, and in the wreckage he had taken the one prize that mattered more than any battlefield, Eleanor. They dragged her from the wild roads of Aquitaine, where she had tried to flee in a monk's disguise, and carried her north under guard. For 15 years she had ruled duchies, commanded courts, and bent nobles to her will. Now she was locked behind iron doors in a damp English keep, watched by guards who would not meet her eyes. The woman who had once defied popes and kings was reduced to pacing circles in silence, her golden hair veiled, her letters censored, her very name fading from the echoing halls she had once ruled. Henry called it protective custody. Everyone else called it what it was, a queen in chains. For Richard, the defeat was an open wound. He was barely 16, yet he had stood beside his elder brothers in defiance of their father, believing the dream their mother had whispered in candlelit chambers. That power could be seized, that they might rule as men rather than wait like supplicants. And now the dream had turned to ash. The young king had fled to beg forgiveness. Geoffrey slunk back to Brittany, and Richard, proud and silent, was forced to kneel in his father's court, feeling the eyes of Henry's barons on him like spears. Henry spared him, not out of mercy, but calculation. He stripped him of dignity, then sent him back to Aquitaine with orders to pacify it, as if to remind him that he held his title not by birthright, but by the king's indulgence. Richard bowed, but inside something twisted into iron. Aquitaine was a land of splendor and rebellion, where castles crowned every ridge and barons ruled like miniature kings. They had risen during the rebellion, sensing weakness in the boy duke, and now they awaited Henry's punishment. Instead, it was Richard who came. He rode south with mailed knights at his back, not as a penitent but as a conqueror. The boy who had failed his father returned as a creature of fire. What followed was less war than purging. Richard besieged their strongholds one by one, tearing down the walls of castles that had stood since the days of Charlemagne. At Talleyrand, he used mangonels to smash the gatehouse to rubble, then ordered the captured garrison hang from the ramparts as warning. At Castillon, he filled the moat with the corpses of fallen men to build an assault path for his troops. The troubadours who had once sung of courtly love now sang of blood and thunder, of the young duke who never flinched from the sword. He showed flashes of mercy when it suited him, granting safe conduct to one rebel who swore fealty before battle. But more often, he made examples. Fear, he had learned, was faster than loyalty. News of his campaign seeped north, past the stone walls of Eleanor's prison. She learned in fragments: a steward's muttered report, a smuggled letter from a loyal vassal, a half-whispered verse of a troubadour's song. Each report struck her like a blow and a benediction. He was everything she had hoped: brilliant, fearless, unstoppable, and everything she had feared. The tenderness she had once seen in him was gone, buried under steel. She wondered if this was her doing. Had she raised him to be too much like her? A soul who could only survive by hardening until he could not bend? In the cold hours of night, Eleanor walked the circumference of her chamber until her legs ached. She pressed her hands to the stone and imagined Aquitaine's warm winds. She remembered the boy riding ponies in her gardens, laughing as his hair tangled in the breeze, and wondered if he remembered her at all. Henry had forbidden her contact, allowing only occasional guarded appearances at court to remind the world she still lived. She sat at banquets like a shadow, watched by Henry's men, forbidden to speak with her sons. When Richard glanced at her, he did so furtively, as if looking at a ghost. Yet their eyes met for an instant once across the hall at Winchester, and in that brief spark, she saw the fire still recognized its forge. Henry, for his part, took satisfaction in their estrangement. He played his sons like pieces on a board, pushing them against one another to keep them from uniting against him again. The young king, still nominal heir, seethed at Richard's rising renown. Geoffrey spun intrigues from Brittany, trying to weaken both brothers, and Henry began grooming his youngest, John, whom he called Lackland, because he had no fief, as his new favorite. He spoke openly of disinheriting Richard from Aquitaine and granting it to John, a deliberate provocation. It worked. Richard's pride ignited like dry tinder, but pride alone was not enough to protect what was his. He tightened his grip on Aquitaine with both hands, building a war machine from the ground up. He drilled his knights until they could form and break ranks on his whistle, adopted the latest siege techniques from Flanders and Gascony, and trained crossbowmen to fire in coordinated volleys that could punch through armor. He demanded scutage and war taxes with ruthless efficiency, funneling coin into fortifications and mercenaries. He learned the art of terror, not chaos, but controlled spectacle, calibrated to crush resistance before it could gather. By 18, he was less a duke than a living campaign. The young king could not bear it. He had the crown, but Richard had the glory, and in the eyes of their peers, glory mattered more. In 1183, the young king rose again in rebellion, this time to strip Richard of Aquitaine. Henry too at first encouraged it, thinking it would humble Richard and reassert his control. Eleanor, still locked away, could only watch as her sons devoured each other like wolves in a trap. The war burned across Limousin and Poitou, castles falling like autumn leaves. Then in the midst of the chaos, the young king sickened with dysentery and died, raving in fever, begging forgiveness, clutching a stolen crucifix. The news hit Richard like a hammer. He had hated his brother, yet the death carved a hollow in him. It also made him Henry's heir, at least in theory. Henry, however, had other plans. He demanded Richard surrender Aquitaine to John and take up the broader Angevin succession. Richard refused. Aquitaine was his by-blood from Eleanor, not Henry's to redistribute. He would not trade his duchy for a crown that Henry could snatch away. Father and son clashed in a cold war of threats and maneuver, each testing the other's resolve. Henry underestimated what Eleanor had planted in Richard's heart. Loyalty had never been her creed. Survival was. Richard had learned it well. Isolated and embattled, Richard made a fateful choice. He crossed into French territory and knelt to Philip II, the young king of France, Henry's rival. Philip saw the opening at once and embraced him as an ally. Together, they plotted to break Henry's power. When Henry learned of this betrayal, he raged, but too late. The lion was already unsheathing his claws. While Richard schemed in the halls of Paris, Eleanor lay awake in her guarded chamber in Sarum Castle. She was over 50 now, her body stiffening, her hair streaked with silver, but her mind burned as sharply as ever. She knew what Richard was doing. She also knew Henry. The old king was still formidable, but age was carving cracks in him, his once boundless energy flagging, his empire fraying, his sons circling like vultures. She had seen it before, long ago in the French court, how even the strongest kings could crumble when time gnawed their certainty. Henry had caged her to break her spirit. He had not understood that she was patient. Stones could wait centuries. So could she. And Richard was the hand she had hidden all these years, the blow she had sharpened in silence. In 1187, news of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin swept across Christendom like thunder. It electrified Richard. Here was a stage vast enough for his fury and his faith, a cause to crown his name in legend. He vowed to take the cross. Henry, sensing he might lose his heir to distant glory, tried once more to force Richard to yield Aquitaine to John. Richard answered not with words but with action. He renewed his pact with Philip, and in 1189 they launched their assault. Henry, old and ill, could not withstand them. He was hunted from castle to castle, betrayed by barons who sensed his strength slipping away. When at last he submitted at Chinon, broken, he found among the list of his enemies the name of John, his beloved youngest. The betrayal crushed him. He muttered that he was the most wretched of fathers, and 2 days later he died. Richard rode to Chinon in triumph, but the victory was hollow. The father he had hated was gone, and in his place lay only the silence of an empty throne. Henry's body was left half naked and unwashed by fleeing servants, abandoned in the chapel while rats scurried in the shadows. Richard ordered it shrouded and borne to Fontevraud, where Eleanor's captivity had once been most bitter. Then he turned and summoned his mother. After 15 years in chains, Eleanor of Aquitaine was free. They brought her out of Sarum Castle, blinking in the summer sun, her hair braided with pearls, her bearing unbowed. She was over 60, yet she walked as if the years had been a dream. When she reached Chinon, Richard descended the steps to meet her. For a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other, the lion she had forged, and the forge that had outlasted everything. He bowed his head and kissed her hand. The rebellion that had begun with chains had ended with her release. Henry was gone. Richard was king, and Eleanor, no longer captive, was about to wield her power openly again, not as queen consort or prisoner, but as the matriarch of an empire. The boy she had once raised among the songs of troubadours had become a storm. Now, for the first time in 15 years, she would stand in its eye. The bells of Westminster tolled like thunder, and London swelled like a living sea. On the 3rd day of September in the year 1189, the Lionheart took the English crown. Richard, Duke of Aquitaine, Count of Poitou, now King of England, stood in the dim gold haze of the abbey while priests anointed his head with holy oil and the choir's voices clawed the vaulted stone. He wore a robe of crimson silk over mail, as if he had come to war even at his coronation. When they lowered the crown onto his brow, he did not smile. His jaw was tight, his eyes fixed beyond the altar, as though the moment was not triumph, but burden, a key turning in a lock he could not yet see. Outside, the city roared his name. Trumpets screamed, banners snapped in the wind. But even as the crown settled on his head, Eleanor stood behind him in the shadows, watching. She had arranged this day with hands invisible to the crowd, negotiating the nobles, quelling the factions, reminding the kingdom that she was the living bridge between the dead Henry and this fearsome son. At 67, her spine was straight as an oak beam. The years in chains had not dulled her. They had annealed her, burned away vanity and hesitation. When Richard turned from the altar, she alone met his gaze level. She had placed the crown on his head, and she knew it. Yet the coronation, like all Angevin glory, carried a shadow. Henry's reign had bled England white to hold his empire together, and Richard's rise had emptied its coffers further still. The crowd cheered him as a warrior king, but he was already looking far from England's shores. To him, this island was not home but treasury, a coffer to be cracked open and spent on glory. Eleanor saw this and did not flinch. She had raised him to burn. Now she would make sure the realm did not burn with him. The omens began the very night of the coronation. In the press of celebration, riots erupted. Londoners turned on the city's Jewish community, stoked by rumors that Jews had dared present gifts at the ceremony despite royal prohibition. Houses were looted, men slaughtered, women dragged screaming through the streets. The next spring in York, a mob cornered the entire Jewish community in Clifford's Tower and set it alight. Richard had already sailed for Normandy, but he sent orders from afar condemning the violence and commanding protection for all Jews as royal property. It was not mercy so much as calculation. Commerce and crown alike required stability, but it showed the cold clarity with which he ruled. He would permit no chaos but his own. He stayed in England barely 6 months. Before the echoes of the coronation faded, he was selling everything not nailed down. Sheriffdoms, wardships, castles, charters, all went to the highest bidder. "I would sell London if I could find a buyer," he quipped, and the barons laughed uneasily because they knew he might mean it. He levied the Saladin tithe, a crushing tax on every household, to fund what he saw as his true destiny, the recapture of Jerusalem. It had fallen to Saladin 2 years before, and Christendom's pride still bled from the wound. Richard saw in it the perfect crucible. To win Jerusalem would be to eclipse his father, to engrave his name among Alexander and Caesar. Eleanor understood the compulsion because it was hers once. She had ridden to Antioch with the Second Crusade decades earlier, scandalizing Europe with her armor and her defiance. She had seen the holy city from a distance, the golden dome gleaming above the barren hills, and had known even then that the place devoured men. Yet she did not stop him. She would not cage what she had unleashed. But if Richard meant to fling himself toward legend, she would be the hand holding the empire steady behind him. In the winter of 1190, she rode the length of England in a fury of motion, gray hair whipping from under her veil, raising ships, stores, coin, oaths. The barons murmured that she rode like a general. Perhaps she did. She summoned abbots and bishops, compelling the church to open its granaries and its treasuries. She bargained with merchants for iron and timber, ordered crossbows by the thousand, salted pork by the ton. She appointed justiciars, first William Longchamp, then others in rapid succession, to rule in Richard's name, and she bent them to her will with a glance. She summoned John, the youngest surviving son, from his estates and warned him with ice in her voice that he would not touch the crown while his brother lived. He bowed, smiling his sly smile. Eleanor did not trust that smile. She never had. Meanwhile, Richard gathered his storm. In Normandy, he assembled a fleet, sleek ships from the Cinque Ports, squat cog transports from the Thames, hired galleys from Genoa. He summoned vassals from across the empire, mailed knights from Anjou, Poitou, Gascony, longbowmen from the Welsh marches, engineers from Flanders who could hurl stones the size of boulders. He met Philip II of France at Vézelay, where they swore to march together to the Holy Land, though their smiles were knives. Philip was brilliant and cold, a spider spinning statecraft in Paris's stone chambers. Richard was fire on horseback. They had once plotted against Henry together. Now they measured each other as rivals. Through it all, Eleanor hovered like a ghost at the edge of empire. She watched from Winchester as the treasure caravans rolled south toward the ports, as the ships swayed at anchor, laden with wheat and wine and war. She wondered if this was what Henry had feared all along, a son too large for any throne, who would use a kingdom like a purse and discard it. She did not blame Richard for it. She had raised him to see crowns as tools, not sanctities. Still, she knew what England would suffer in his absence. She remembered the famines and tax riots of her youth, the way power could rot from the inside when left untended. So she stayed. She would be the ballast while he was the spear. In July 1190, Richard and Philip sailed from Vézelay with two glittering hosts. The Channel winds howled, and many ships were driven ashore. Richard pressed on, pausing at Sicily, where he tore through the island's politics like a blade through silk, forcing the regent to release his sister Joanna from house arrest and extorting gold from the treasury. From there he struck east to Cyprus, where the renegade Isaac Komnenos defied him. Richard stormed the island in a whirlwind, captured Isaac in chains of silver, and seized Cyprus outright. It was the first glimpse of what he would become in the Holy Land. Brilliant, relentless, utterly unsentimental. He sold the island to the Templars, then to Guy of Lusignan, planting a Latin outpost that would endure for centuries. Back in England, Eleanor watched the news ripple home like distant thunder. She read the accounts with a strange mix of wonder and dread. Richard was carving triumphs across the map as if the world itself were kindling. But she knew how quickly flame consumed what bore it. His treasury was draining, his vassals chafed under the regents she had set over them, and John was circling like a hawk. She met John at Windsor that winter, her gaze cold as the frost. He smiled his courtly smile and swore loyalty. She did not believe him. By the spring of 1191, Richard had reached the Levant. He arrived at Acre, where the crusader host had besieged the city for 2 grinding years. Philip was there already, sickly and sullen. When Richard disembarked, he electrified the camp. He limped ashore with a fever, wrapped in silks. Yet within days he was directing siege engines, hurling boulders into the city walls. When Acre fell, it was Richard who strode through the breach, not Philip. In the aftermath, quarrels flared between them over who would claim the spoils and over the kingship of Jerusalem. Their alliance dissolved like salt in water. Philip slunk home in disgust, leaving Richard the undisputed master of the crusade. Eleanor read the dispatches with eyes that did not blink. She knew what this meant. Richard had severed his last tether. He belonged now to legend, not to England. He was carving his name in blood on the shores of the Holy Land, and she was left to hold the crumbling empire behind him. She was old now, nearly 70, and each winter weighed her bones with lead. Yet she rode, ruled, schemed with the fury of youth. She toured the shires to soothe restive barons, replaced corrupt sheriffs, balanced the exchequer, quelled riots with promises and threats. When rumors came that Richard had died of fever, she crushed them like vermin. She knew he would not die until the world itself broke him. He was her son. By the summer of 1191, news came of his victory at Arsuf, how he had shattered Saladin's cavalry by holding his knights in iron discipline until the moment came to strike, how he had led the charge himself, cutting through the enemy like a scythe through grain. Europe roared his name. Songs hailed him as the greatest warrior of Christendom. Eleanor read them in her candlelit chamber, alone. Pride burned in her like wine, yet beneath it lay something colder, the sense that he was no longer hers. Richard had become the very embodiment of what she had once dreamed, a king who bent the world. But he was also what she feared most, a man who belonged to glory more than to life. And as she set down the parchment, listening to the wind rattle the shutters of Winchester, she wondered, not for the first time, whether the crown she had fought to give him was a gift or a curse. The heat lay like hammered bronze over the coast of Palestine, and the air smelled of salt and rot and iron. Beneath the crumbling walls of Acre, tens of thousands of men had baked for 2 years in their own sweat and desperation, trying to choke the city into submission. The camp was a graveyard of splintered siege towers, rotting horses, and the bones of forgotten crusaders. And then, out of the sea, came Richard. He arrived in June of 1191, borne on a fleet of white-sailed ships that glittered like teeth against the horizon. His banners rose crimson above the surf, emblazoned with 3 golden lions, and the camp erupted in cheers so fierce they seemed to shake the sand. Richard came ashore limping, fevered from dysentery, his skin gray beneath the silks. But within days he was everywhere, directing mangonels, inspecting trenches, rallying the weary host. Philip of France, who had languished at Acre for months, watched from his pavilion, pale and sour, as the Lionheart devoured the siege like a man starved. The city fell on the 12th of July. Its walls, once proud, sagged inward like old teeth. The Saracen garrison surrendered, marching out with their banners furled. Richard and Philip strode side by side through the breach, but only Richard radiated command. The air buzzed with his name. Even the Muslim chroniclers wrote of his ferocity, his presence like a drawn blade. But triumph curdled quickly. The negotiations for the prisoners' ransom collapsed. Saladin delayed, hedged, bought time to muster his strength. Richard had neither patience nor mercy. Before the eyes of both armies, he ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim captives, their throats cut on the plain below the city walls. The ground ran black with blood. The songs in Europe hailed it as righteous vengeance. But Eleanor, reading the news by candlelight in Winchester, felt her stomach turn cold. She had seen enough wars to know when cruelty became a habit, not a tactic. Richard was becoming what she had feared, not merely fearless, but merciless. The boy she had raised on Troubadour's songs of honor was now writing his own verses in flesh. Philip left for home soon after, feigning illness, but really because he knew he could not outshine Richard. That suited Richard well enough. He did not want partners. He wanted enemies. He struck south along the coast, shadowed inland by Saladin's army. Day after day, the Muslim horse archers swarmed his flanks like hornets, loosing clouds of arrows and vanishing. Richard's army was a moving fortress, a column of steel and discipline. He placed his crossbowmen on the outer ranks, their bolts punching through horse and man alike, while the infantry held their shields like iron walls. Behind them, the knights waited silent on their destriers, banners furled, holding the fury coiled within them. On the 7th of September, on the dusty plain near Arsuf, Saladin struck with all his might. The Muslim cavalry crashed against Richard's column from dawn to noon, wheeling, striking, melting away, only to return again in a screaming tide. The crusader line held, locked like the jaws of a trap. When the Hospitaller knights at the rear finally broke ranks and charged without orders, Richard saw the moment and seized it. He spurred forward, banner unfurling, and unleashed the entire cavalry in a single thunderous wave. It smashed through Saladin's center like an iron plow through dry earth. The Muslim line shattered. Saladin retreated, stunned. Arsuf belonged to the Lionheart. The news raced across Christendom like fire through dry reeds. Songs sprouted overnight, painting Richard as the avenger of Jerusalem, the hammer of Saladin. In Paris, the people whispered that Philip had fled out of envy. In Rome, the Pope gave thanks at the altar. And in Winchester, Eleanor stood alone in her solar, the parchment trembling in her hands. Pride burned in her like molten gold. Yet beneath it coiled dread. Richard had become everything she had forged him to be. Brilliant, audacious, invincible. And she could no longer reach him. He was a figure of legend now, and legends belonged to no one. While Richard strode through blood and fire, Eleanor ruled a kingdom made of whispers. She was nearly 70, her bones aching in the damp. Yet she rode the length of England with the endurance of youth. She summoned sheriffs, replaced corrupt justiciars, and kept the treasury tight as a drum. She negotiated with Scottish envoys, placated Welsh lords, soothed the shire courts with her cold charm. She was regent in all but name, though the charters bore Richard's seal. And always like a shadow at the edge of her vision, John lingered. John had slithered into power as Richard emptied the realm to fund his crusade. Eleanor had given him lands, hoping to tether him. Instead, he had grown bold. He whispered to barons that Richard might never return, that England needed a king who actually cared for it. He hoarded coin, built alliances, sent secret letters to Philip. Eleanor intercepted some of them and burned them without comment. She had raised too many sons not to recognize the smell of ambition. She watched John like a falcon watches a snake, silent, unblinking. Far away, Richard marched inland, always within sight of the coast, dragging his siege engines and supply trains over scorched earth. He approached Jerusalem twice, each time halting within sight of the city's golden dome of the rock. His men knelt in the dust, weeping, begging him to attack. He refused. The ground was baked dry, the wells poisoned, the city's defenses strong, Saladin's army intact. To take Jerusalem, he said, was easy. To hold it was impossible. He would not throw away the crusade on glory without permanence. His generals raged, his soldiers despaired, but he held firm. This was the paradox of Richard, a man who charged like lightning, yet thought like a chess player. He would not win Jerusalem if it meant losing everything else. Instead, he struck where Saladin was weakest, the ports. He seized Jaffa, repaired its walls in a frenzy, turned it into a fortress supply base. Saladin counterattacked, and Richard rode out half-armored, sword in one hand, rallying the defenders with a roar. He cut through the attackers like a scythe, and the Muslim army broke. The two commanders, weary and wary, opened talks. They signed the Treaty of Jaffa in September 1192. It left Jerusalem in Muslim hands, but guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe passage, restored the coastal fortresses to the crusaders, and secured a fragile peace. Richard had not taken the Holy City, but he had saved the crusader states from extinction. He called it victory. So did Europe. Yet to many of his own knights it tasted like ashes. Eleanor read the treaty terms in her solar at Winchester, the rain slanting against the windows. She felt the words like stones in her chest. Richard had won everything except the thing he wanted most. He had carved glory across the Levant, yet stood outside the Holy Sepulchre, staring at it like a starving man barred from the feast. She understood that look. She had seen it once in her own mirror, returning from Antioch in disgrace. Glory was never enough. It never filled the hollows it carved. And now he was coming home. England trembled at the thought. He had been gone 3 years. The coffers were empty, the barons restless, the fields scarred by taxes. John had sunk his claws deep into the realm. He had seized castles, forged alliances, hinted he might take the crown if Richard drowned at sea. Eleanor crushed him like a fist. She summoned him to Winchester, her gaze cold as the stones. He babbled excuses, swore loyalty, kissed her ring. She sent him to Ireland with orders not to return without her leave. He obeyed for now. She could not afford to falter. The Angevin Empire was a tapestry of fraying threads. Normandy, Aquitaine, Anjou, Poitou, England, all bound by Richard's name and her will. If either failed, the whole cloth would unravel. She held it together alone, the last pillar of a crumbling world, even as age gnawed her bones. At night she lay awake listening to the wind howl through the tower slits and wondered how long she could keep the walls standing until her lion returned. But the sea was not kind. Richard's fleet scattered in storms. He took a handful of men and tried to cross Europe in disguise, through lands ruled by his enemies. He was recognized near Vienna by men loyal to Duke Leopold of Austria, the same man Richard had humiliated at Acre. They seized him like a prize hawk. The news struck England like lightning. The Lionheart, conqueror of Acre and Arsuf, was a prisoner in chains. Eleanor stood frozen in the hall at Winchester as the messenger stammered the words. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned and began issuing orders. Her voice was calm, her eyes like flint. The regency would hold. The empire would endure. She would bring him home. She had been the architect of his rise, the guardian of his realm, the silent fire behind his throne. Now she would become his ransom. The Lionheart had gone to the ends of the earth for glory, and the world had swallowed him. Eleanor would pry it open with her bare hands if she had to. Winter sank its claws into England when the news came. It swept through Winchester like a plague wind. Richard the Lionheart, conqueror of Acre, breaker of Saladin's line, was a prisoner. He had vanished on the long road home from the Holy Land, lost in the maze of hostile Europe, and now word spread that he had been taken near Vienna by Duke Leopold of Austria, the same man Richard had humiliated at Acre when he tore down Leopold's banner from the captured city's walls and cast it into the mud. Humiliation had long memory. Leopold had seized him in secret and handed him over to Emperor Henry the Aquitaine, who meant to hold him until England bled itself dry in gold. Eleanor listened in silence as the messenger stammered through the report. The hall was cold, the air heavy with the iron tang of candle smoke. Around her, the courtiers stirred in panic, whispering of the empire's collapse, of John's ambitions, of Philip of France sharpening his knives. Eleanor's face did not move. When the man fell silent, she rose. The years had bent her bones, silvered her hair, hollowed her cheeks. But in that moment, she seemed to tower like a living pillar of stone. She ordered the court cleared, the council summoned, the treasuries opened. The regency would hold. The empire would not fall. She would bring her son home. Henry VI's ransom demand arrived soon after, and it was monstrous. 150,000 marks of silver, nearly 3 years of England's entire revenue. It was not ransom. It was extortion. It was a king's corpse price. Eleanor read the figures by lamplight and felt the weight settle on her like a stone cathedral. She had seen realms break under lesser burdens. She knew what this would cost in taxes, in blood, in revolt. And still she set her jaw. They would pay it. They would pay it because they must. Richard had carved glory across the world. She would drag him back from the jaws of it. She became a storm. At 70, she rode the length of England through sleet and frozen mud, wrapped in furs, her white hair whipping from beneath her hood. She summoned the bishops to St. Albans and stripped the churches bare. Chalices, reliquaries, candlesticks, all melted into bars. She levied a special tax on every household, the ransom tax, and sent the sheriffs riding with iron-bound chests. She ordered every knight, baron, and merchant to bring silver to the exchequer or forfeit their lands. She seized the wool trade, drained the coinage, sold the crown jewels. Gold poured toward her like blood toward a wound. The people grumbled, then submitted. They had always feared her, and now they feared her more. She moved like something inevitable, unanswerable. The chroniclers wrote that she seemed tireless, riding from shire to shire in a fury of motion, her voice ringing in cathedral naves and market squares, her hands clutching ledgers, her eyes sharp as a drawn sword. They had thought her old. They were wrong. She had been waiting her whole life for this battle, not a war of lances, but of will. While she scoured England, she wrote to every corner of Europe. She flayed the Pope with letters demanding he excommunicate Leopold and Henry for daring to imprison a crusader. She begged and threatened the Italian merchant leagues to lend her ships. She bribed the emperor's courtiers with velvet purses of gold. She sent envoys to the German princes with gifts and promises. She even wrote to Saladin's brother in Damascus, asking if the Sultan might intercede, though she knew he would not. It did not matter. She would rattle every throne until they yielded. John slithered into the vacuum like smoke. With Richard gone, he declared himself heir, seized castles, bribed sheriffs, and whispered to the barons that the Lionheart would never return. He even allied with Philip of France, Richard's mortal enemy, promising to cede Normandy in exchange for French support. Eleanor struck back with a speed that stunned even her enemies. She summoned the loyal justiciars, declared John a traitor, and stripped him of his estates. She marched on his castles, hammering their gates with siege engines, until his supporters scattered like crows. She cornered him at Windsor and forced him to swear fealty on the Gospels while she watched, eyes like embers. John knelt. She did not smile. She sent him to Normandy under guard. England would not fall to a usurper while she still drew breath. All that winter and spring, she drove the ransom campaign like a general commanding an army. Coins clinked in the counting houses until the floors trembled. Silver bars were dragged to the coast on ox carts, loaded into ships bound for Germany under heavy guard. Yet the emperor demanded more, always more. Eleanor raised it. She squeezed England until the blood came, and still she rode, tireless, relentless, her body a cage of pain, but her will unbreakable. Chroniclers later wrote that no woman had ever ruled England as she did that year. They were wrong. No man ever had either. By early 1194, she had gathered the full ransom, 150,000 marks, over 2 million ounces of silver, a sum so vast that its removal from England collapsed the currency for years. The emperor staggered, finally yielded. Richard was brought from his cell in the damp dungeons of Trifle's castle, blinking in the winter light, thinner but unbowed. They dressed him in silk and gold for his release, as if to hide the iron scars. The ransom caravan met him on the Rhine, guarded by imperial knights and English envoys. And there at the head of it rode Eleanor. She had crossed half of Europe in the teeth of winter to bring him home. She rode a black palfrey draped in crimson, her hair veiled in white, her bearing straight as a sword. The German chroniclers wrote that she seemed carved from marble, her eyes bright as molten gold. When she dismounted, Richard went to his knees before her, took her hands and kissed them. For a moment, the Lionheart looked like a child again. They returned to England in March. As their ship cut up the Thames, the crowds lined the banks screaming his name, their voices ragged with disbelief and joy. Bells rang from every steeple. Fireworks cracked over the tower. Richard strode ashore at Sandwich in armor, crowned with a wreath of laurel, and swore to make his enemies choke on their triumph. John fled to France in terror. Philip, hearing of Richard's release, is said to have muttered to his court, "Take care, the devil is loose." At Winchester, Eleanor stood on the dais of the great hall and watched her son reclaim his throne. He was 36 now, scarred, hardened, his face carved thinner by fever and chains. The crusade had burned the softness out of him. He radiated fury and purpose, a blade drawn from his sheath. Yet when his gaze met hers for an instant, she saw the boy she had raised among the troubadours, laughing in the gardens of Poitiers. He had gone to the ends of the earth and returned to her alive. That was enough. For Eleanor, this was her zenith. She had defied the Pope, stripped the church, crushed rebellion, bent England to her will, and bought back her son from the jaws of the world. No queen of Christendom had ever done the like. The chroniclers would remember Richard as the Lionheart, but those who had lived those years would remember the white-haired woman who had walked through fire to free him. But even in triumph, Eleanor felt the weight of time pressing at her shoulders. She was 70 and the years had begun to hollow her. Her hands trembled when she unclenched them. At night, her joints ached like rusting hinges. She knew she could not hold the empire forever. She had raised Richard to rule as a storm, and storms did not endure. Soon he would turn against Philip again to defend the Angevin lands in France, and the world would shake. She could only pray the empire she had held together with her bare hands would not crumble when she let go. For now, though, she stood in the great hall as the banners unfurled and the crowds roared, and she let herself breathe. The Lionheart lived. The empire stood. The world would remember this day, and perhaps they would remember her too, not as a consort or a captive or a shadow in the margins, but as the mother who ransomed a king. Spring came to England like a false smile, soft and bright, while war thickened on the wind. Richard had been home barely weeks when the crown itched on his head like iron too tight. The crusade had left him broke, his vassals restive, and his enemies fat with opportunity. Philip of France had feasted on his absence, gnawing at the borders of Normandy like a rat at a coffin. John, ever the serpent, had slithered to Philip's side and offered him Richard's lands. Now the Lionheart stood once more on English soil, breathing the damp air of a kingdom he barely knew. And his gaze was already fixed across the Channel. England was a purse. Normandy was his heart. He would not let Philip tear it out. Eleanor saw the hunger in him and felt her bones go cold. She had not fought half the world to free him, only to see him fling himself into another furnace. Yet she knew she could not stop him. He was her son, her masterpiece, and her ruin. He would not live in peace. He was not made for it. In May of 1194, barely a month after his release, Richard crossed the Channel with an army. Eleanor stood on the cliffs of Barfleur as his sails vanished into the grey chop. the wind clawing at her veils. She did not know if she would ever see him again. She turned inland and began the grim work of stabilizing the realm behind him, because someone had to. She was 70. She had outlived rebellion, captivity, and despair. She would outlive this too. Richard struck like thunder. He swept through Normandy in a blaze of sieges, tearing Philip's conquests apart stone by stone. He stormed Locks, overran Vendôme, ripped Tours from the French grasp. He fought with a fury that bordered on madness, riding at the front of every charge, sleeping in his armor, eating in the saddle. Philip, who preferred to weave power from treaties and lies, reeled before him. Chroniclers said it was as if a hurricane had descended on France. But war cost silver, and Richard's coffers were hollowed by the crusade and the ransom. He squeezed his vassals mercilessly, levied scutage, sold offices, wrung the realm dry. The barons muttered, the peasants groaned, the church bristled. Eleanor heard the rumblings as she toured England, her joints aching in the rain. She smoothed them with promises and veiled threats, reminding the nobles that a living Richard was their shield against French conquest, and a dead Richard would drag them all into ruin. They listened. They feared her more than they loved him. Even in her absence from the battlefields, her shadow stretched over them. She brokered truces, bribed mercenaries, arranged loans from Lombard bankers. She sent letters to Aquitaine, rallying the southern barons to Richard's banner. She even negotiated with Pope Celestine, begging him to excommunicate Philip, though the Pope demurred. She worked like a dying heart, pumping blood through a body that was already trying to rot. Richard pressed on. In 1196, he conceived a fortress to anchor Normandy forever, a bastion so strong it would terrify Philip from even dreaming of conquest. He chose a jagged cliff over the Seine and raised Chateau Gaillard. It rose in a single year, a white fang of stone, bristling with towers and murder holes, its walls angled to deflect siege engines, its moats carved from the living rock. It cost a fortune, but Richard laughed at the expense. If its walls were of butter, I would hold it, he boasted. It was the most advanced fortress in Christendom, a declaration carved in stone that the Angevin Empire would stand forever. Eleanor received reports of it from her messengers and read them with mixed awe and despair. She had raised him to think like a conqueror, and now he built monuments to eternity as if he could outlast death by sheer defiance. She knew better. She had seen too many great men crumble into dust, their empires dissolving like salt and rain. But she said nothing. She wrote letters praising the fortress and sent engineers from Anjou to aid its construction. It was what he wanted from her, not caution, but faith. By 1197, Philip's advance had been broken. Richard hammered him from Gisors to Courcelles, retaking almost every fortress the French had seized. The Lionheart roared louder than ever, but Eleanor could see the edges fraying. He had no heir. He refused to marry. Spurning Berengaria of Navarre, the queen she had chosen for him, leaving her abandoned in a convent-like seclusion. He laughed when the barons begged him to sire a son. He spoke only of war, of honor, of burning his name so deep into the world that it would never fade. He seemed to believe that if he roared loudly enough, death would not hear him coming. Eleanor, who had danced with death her whole life, knew better. She felt time in her bones now like a tide rising. She had begun to fade in subtle ways. Her hands trembled when she signed charters. Her sight blurred in the evenings. Sometimes her knees locked halfway up a staircase and she had to rest, clutching the stone like an old crone. She thought often of Henry, of the way he had burned himself hollow with ceaseless motion until he simply fell apart. She feared Richard would do the same. She feared he already was. In the winter of 1198, she summoned him to Lisieux under pretense of counsel. When he entered the hall, snow-crusted on his boots, he seemed more specter than man. Gaunt, pale, eyes fever-bright. He kissed her cheek and spoke of Philip's retreat, of fortresses retaken, of glory. She listened in silence. When he was done, she said softly that he must slow down, that empires could be lost not only to enemies, but to exhaustion. He smiled at her like a man humoring a ghost. Then he was gone again, back to the mud and iron. The war reached its crescendo in early 1199. Philip's forces were broken. Normandy stood intact. Richard's power was at its height. Yet even at the summit, fate waited with a knife. In March, while besieging the petty castle of Chalus-Chabrol in Limousin, hardly more than a robber baron's nest, Richard rode too close to the walls. A defender loosed a crossbow bolt. It struck his shoulder just above the collarbone, driving deep. The wound festered, infection blackened the flesh, and fever took him. For 9 days he raved and sweated in the tent, his body devouring itself. He knew he was dying. He named his youngest brother John as heir, the bitterest irony of all. The empire he had built on fire would pass to the son Eleanor had always feared. Eleanor was in Fontevraud when the message came. She was 77, her hair white as frost, her body frail as parchment. She rode through the night to Chalus, through sleet and mud, driven by something older than fear. She found him in the dim tent, skin waxen, lips cracked, eyes hollow. For a moment she thought he was already gone. Then his gaze flickered and found her. He smiled faintly. It was not his old smile. It was something softer, almost a child's. He died in her arms on the 6th of April, as the spring rain drummed on the canvas. The Lionheart was 41. He had conquered half the world and kept none of it. The earth swallowed him like it had swallowed all the rest. They buried him at Fontevraud Abbey beside Henry, the father he had hated, and Eleanor stood between their tombs like a shadow between two storms. Around her the empire trembled. Philip waited like a vulture. John sharpened his claws. Normandy's barons wavered. The great Angevin machine, held together for decades by the sheer will of Henry, Richard, and Eleanor, was cracking at last. She felt no tears. She was beyond them. She had outlived her enemies, her husband, her favorite son. She had outlived her own youth. Now she walked the abbey's cloisters alone, the stones cold under her feet, the air damp with spring. The wind hissed through the cedars like the whisper of time. She thought of the boy riding ponies in the gardens of Poitiers, laughing, the sunlight tangled in his hair. She had given him the world, and he had set it on fire. And now he was gone. The bells tolled over Fontevraud as they lowered Richard into the earth, and Eleanor stood among the banners like a revenant from an older age. The monks chanted in the cold air, their voices hollow as wind through crypts. Beside Richard's bier lay Henry's tomb, the stone effigy of the man who had once ruled half of Christendom, now silent as bone. Between them, Eleanor seemed less mourner than monument, an ancient figure who had seen empires rise and burn to ash. She felt the stone flags cold under her feet, the ache of age in every joint, and the weight of silence pressing from all sides. Her lion was gone. The empire he had defended with fire trembled on the edge of collapse, and she, who had once carried crowns like torches, now stood alone among the ruins. In the days after the funeral, messengers came in flocks, their boots dripping with mud, their eyes bright with fear. Normandy teetered on revolt. Philip of France had already crossed the Seine, his banners snapping like red knives against the wind. The barons who had bent their knees to Richard's sword now wavered before John's hollow shadow. They whispered that John was weak, faithless, craven. Eleanor did not argue. She knew it was true, but he was what remained, and she would make him king or die trying. At 77, she gathered her strength like a general, mustering the remnants of a broken army. She wrote to the Norman lords, reminding them of their oaths. She summoned the Angevins, the Poitevins, the Gascons, and spoke to them not as a queen but as the mother of their house, the last living memory of its grandeur. She promised that the blood of the Plantagenets still ran strong, that John would defend them as Richard had. Her voice rang through the great halls like iron striking stone. Some believed her, more feared her. That was enough. Then she rode. Age had whittled her to bone and sinew. Her hair white as hoarfrost, her hands twisted by pain. She could not mount without help, but she rode all the same, through the mud of Anjou and the forests of Poitou, through sleet and hail and the sucking mire of spring roads. Chroniclers wrote that she rode like death itself, inexorable, unstoppable, appearing at castles like an omen. She demanded oaths. She offered rewards. She threatened ruin. And the barons, remembering what she had done to those who defied Richard, bent their knees. By sheer will, she bound the splintering southern half of the Angevin world to John's cause. Meanwhile, she sent envoys to England, commanding the justiciars to crown John before Philip could contest it. The coronation took place at Westminster in May of 1199. John wore Richard's crown and Richard's mantle, but the hall was half empty, the cheers thin. He stood stiff as wood, smiling his sly smile, and the barons watched him with eyes like knives. Eleanor was not there. She was in Anjou, still riding, still binding the shreds of the empire to her name. She had no illusions. John was not Richard. He was not even Henry. He was clever but not strong, charming but not steadfast. Yet he was blood, and blood was all she had left. As summer came, Philip's war banners spread like a rash across Normandy. John faltered. Eleanor watched from Poitiers, her heart a cold stone. She had spent her life forging sons into weapons, and now she was left with a blade made of glass. She tried to buttress him with her own prestige, arranging treaties, dispatching letters under her seal. She summoned the lords of Aquitaine to swear fealty to him, their voices echoing grudgingly in the cathedral nave. But she could see it in their eyes. They did not love him. They feared nothing about him. They were already calculating how to survive his fall. The ghosts of her dead sons stalked her. Henry the young king, brilliant and frivolous, dead of fever and rebellion. Geoffrey, schemer of Brittany, trampled to death in a tournament. Richard, her lion, pierced by a peasant's quarrel at the height of his power. They came to her in dreams, laughing and arguing as they had in youth, their faces still smooth, their eyes bright. She woke weeping and furious, slamming her fists against the bedposts. She had buried 3 sons, and the 4th would likely destroy what they had built. She had survived them all, and survival felt like punishment. In the winter of 1200, she made one last gamble. She rode to the Spanish frontier across the Pyrenean snows to arrange a marriage for her granddaughter, Blanche of Castile. Blanche was the child of her dead daughter Eleanor, a quick-eyed girl of 12 with steel already in her spine. Eleanor meant to wed her to the French heir, Louis, to buy peace with Philip and preserve what fragments of the Angevin world remained. The journey nearly killed her. She was almost 80, her body racked with fevers, her hands swollen with pain, her breath shallow in the high mountain air. Yet she pressed on, wrapped in furs, borne in a litter when she could no longer ride. She reached Burgos pale as parchment, her voice a rasp, and sealed the betrothal with her trembling hands. Then she turned back north, crawling through the snows like a wounded beast, and collapsed at Fontevraud. She would never leave it again. There in the quiet cloisters, the roar of her life ebbed away. The nuns walked softly around her, as if afraid she might shatter. She no longer commanded armies or reshaped kingdoms. She spent her days in the chapter house, cloaked in wool, staring at the candle flames guttering in the draught. Sometimes she spoke to no one for hours, lips moving soundlessly, eyes fixed on something beyond the walls. Sometimes she called for Richard, forgetting he was gone. Sometimes she whispered to Henry's tomb, though what she said no one heard. The empire unraveled around her. Philip gnawed at Normandy until it cracked. John squandered his armies and betrayed his allies, lurching from blunder to blunder. England slid toward ruin, and still she lived, the last living memory of its grandeur, a relic of an age when kings were fire and women were stone. In March of 1204, the cold returned one last time. Eleanor took to her bed, her breath thin, her hands cold as marble. The nuns crowded the chamber, murmuring prayers. She lay still, her eyes half closed, the candlelight trembling on her hollow cheeks. She thought of the sunlit courts of Aquitaine, of the troubadours singing love songs as she walked among them, crowned with roses. She thought of the crusades' dust and the clatter of lances, of Henry's fierce laughter, of Richard's roar at Arsouf. She thought of her sons as boys running barefoot through the gardens of Poitiers, their hair bright in the light. She thought of the empire she had built and watched burn. Eleanor of Aquitaine, Duchess, Queen, Regent, matriarch, the last lioness of her house, died on the 1st of April 1204 at the age of 82. They laid her in the abbey at Fontevraud beside Henry and Richard, her stone effigy carved with a book in her hands, as if even in death she still read the story of the world she had shaped. Outside, the spring wind hissed through the cedars, scattering petals across the cloisters. She had outlived her husband, her enemies, and her children. She had outlived her empire. And as the bells tolled over Fontevraud, echoing across the crumbling lands she once ruled, it seemed that the world itself paused to listen, not to mourn, but to wonder how one woman's will had held the sky aloft for so long, and what would happen now that she was gone. The bells of Fontevraud had scarcely gone silent when the cracks in the world Eleanor had held together split wide. She had been gone only weeks, her body sealed in stone between Henry and Richard, when the Angevin Empire began to fall like a house of cards in a gale. It was as if her death had released something, an invisible pressure that had kept the chaos at bay. While she lived, the barons feared her. While she breathed, the fabric of the empire clung together out of habit, like stones held by the last threads of ivy. Now the ivy was gone. The stones began to fall. John wore the crown, but it sat on him like a borrowed cloak, slipping at the shoulders. He had not inherited Richard's glory or Henry's will, only their enemies. Philip of France, patient as wrought, saw his chance. He poured across the Seine, his banners flaring like blood against the gray sky, and the Norman barons, who had once bent the knee to Richard out of awe, now bent to Philip out of fear. One by one, castles that had resisted decades of siege opened their gates. Gisors fell. Le Vaudreuil, Chateau Gaillard, Richard's proud white fang above the Seine, endured a winter siege and then cracked like ice, its walls shorn open, its garrison dragged out in chains. The jewel of Richard's legacy lay in ruins. Normandy was gone. John raged, but his rage was hollow. He had neither his father's endurance nor his brother's fire. He schemed instead of fought, lied instead of led. His vassals sensed it and slunk away like wolves from a sick alpha. In Aquitaine, where Eleanor's word had once been law, the southern lords rose in rebellion. In Brittany, her grandsons by Geoffrey sharpened their claims. Even England itself quivered. The barons muttered in the cloisters of Westminster that John was cursed, that Eleanor's spirit had shielded the dynasty, and her passing had broken its spell. In the taverns, men whispered that she haunted the corridors of Fontevraud at night, pacing between the tombs with a book in her hands, her gaze like cold fire, searching for someone strong enough to carry her crown. No one came. The world she had built unraveled as if it had only ever been stitched together by her hands. The Angevin Empire had never been a true nation, only a storm lashed together by the will of three extraordinary souls: Henry's ceaseless hunger, Richard's blazing ferocity, Eleanor's iron patience. With her gone and her sons dead, the storm dissolved into mist. By 1205, Philip stood master of almost all their French lands. John, stripped and humiliated, crept back to England with the remnants of his court. The empire that had once stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees had shrunk to a damp island and a few stubborn outposts. Eleanor's world was gone, yet her shadow lingered. Even in ruin, the bones of her creation shaped the map. The legal reforms Henry had hammered into place still bound England. The troubadour culture she had fostered in Aquitaine still burned like embers, sparking the literature of France. The crusading ideal Richard had embodied still haunted Europe's imagination. And everywhere, her name clung like a ghost to the stones. Eleanor's castles, Eleanor's roads, Eleanor's gardens gone to seed. The people who had once feared her now spoke her name in half whispers, as if unsure she was truly dead. John felt her ghost most of all. He tried to rule as if she still stood behind him, issuing decrees in her imperious tone, invoking her name in charters, ordering Fontevraud's abbess to keep her tomb crowned with lilies. But he was not her heir. He had her blood, but none of her marrow. Where she had ruled with cold justice, he ruled with caprice. Where she had welded factions into unity, he shattered them with suspicion. Even the few who had been loyal to Eleanor could not stomach him. He squandered her legacy like a drunk spilling wine across a table. In 1214, a decade after her death, John tried to reclaim her lost world. He crossed to the continent with a patched-together army, hoping to drive Philip from Normandy and revive the empire. Instead, at Bouvines, the French crushed him. His army fled. His allies abandoned him. He limped back to England in disgrace, the dream of the Angevin Empire dead at last. 2 years later, his barons rose in open rebellion and forced him to sign the Magna Carta, stripping his crown of powers that Henry and Richard had wielded like thunderbolts. The Plantagenet glory Eleanor had built was not merely broken, it was buried. And yet, even as John's world collapsed, Eleanor's spirit glimmered in strange places. Her granddaughter Blanche of Castile, the quiet-eyed child she had hauled across the Pyrenees through fever and snow, became Queen of France, wife of Louis VII, and later regent for their son. Blanche ruled with a steel will that made hardened barons tremble, forging France into the strongest kingdom in Europe. Chroniclers said she had her great-grandmother's eyes bright as molten gold, and her voice like iron wrapped in silk. Through Blanche, Eleanor's blood flowered again, not in the empire she had built, but in the empire that had destroyed it. It was as if Eleanor, even in death, had reached across time to choose the stronger branch of her own lineage, as she had always done. Fontevraud grew quiet as the years passed. The world forgot its abbey except as a curiosity, a place where kings slept in stone. Ivy climbed the cloisters. Moss softened the steps Eleanor had once strode. Her tomb lay between Henry's and Richard's, their carved stone faces forever staring at the ceiling they could not see. Pilgrims sometimes came, touching the cold marble of her hands where she lay carved with an open book, as if still reading the story of the world she had shaped. They said the air around her was colder than the rest of the crypt, as if the stone itself remembered the force that had once moved within it. The empire was gone. The maps had changed. The blood she had fought to preserve now thinned in a dozen royal veins scattered across Europe. But her story endured, whispered in the corners of castles, in the songs of troubadours who still sang of Aquitaine's golden age. They sang of a woman who had ruled when women were supposed to disappear, who had raised warriors from her womb and bent kings to her will, who had carried an empire on her shoulders until her bones cracked beneath it. They sang of her as if she were a myth, and perhaps she was. For Eleanor of Aquitaine had done what no queen of her age was meant to do. She had seized history in her hands and remade it, and when she died, history itself seemed to stop for a heartbeat, like a machine that had lost its engine. The men who came after her stumbled through the ruins of what she had built, groping for the shape of her vanished shadow. None of them ever found it. None of them ever could. And so she lingered, not in flesh, not even in stone, but in the hollow she had carved into the world by sheer force of will. The empire was dust, the men were bones, but the shape of her absence remained vast and echoing, like a cathedral after the candles have burned down, where you can still feel the heat in the darkness and hear faintly the roar of the lioness who once held up the sky. Years turned over like slow wheels, grinding the splendor of the Angevin age into dust. Where once Eleanor's empire had stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, only fragments remained. England, some scraps of Ireland, a few stubborn ports on the French coast. The rest had fallen to Philip of France, whose patient web had snared everything Richard had bled for. John ruled what was left, but ruled it badly, clawing at his shrinking realm like a drowning man clutching reeds. The barons hated him, the church loathed him, and the people feared him without respecting him. And yet, even as John dragged her world toward ruin, Eleanor's ghost seemed to move through the ruins like wind through the ribs of a dead cathedral. It was not the empire she left behind that endured, but the shape of her, etched into the memory of every court she had ever touched. John himself felt it like a weight on his shoulders. He invoked her name endlessly, trying to borrow her authority from the grave. He sent orders for her tomb at Fontevraud to be kept draped in flowers, for her effigy to be polished, for prayers to be said in her memory each Easter. He issued charters, "In reverence to our most illustrious mother, the Lady Eleanor, who shone like a star over the realms of the English and the Aquitanian. But the words rang hollow. He lacked her gravity, her cold fire, her instinct for power. Where she had fused realms into a single will, he let them splinter like rotted wood. He was the echo of her thunder, thin and pitiful. By 1215, her empire's collapse was almost complete. John's tyranny sparked rebellion. The barons rose against him and forced him to seal the Magna Carta, binding the crown in chains of law Henry would have spat upon. John signed it with shaking hands, then tried to break it, plunging the realm into civil war. He died in 1216, sick and broken, his treasures lost in a flooded fen, his body bloated and alone. Chroniclers said the stench of him lingered for weeks. He left behind a 9-year-old boy, Henry, in a kingdom in tatters. The Angevin storm was over. The Plantagenet line would survive, but as something smaller, tamer. The wild, blazing age Eleanor had embodied was gone, yet her legacy did not die with her empire. It had seeped into the bloodlines of Europe like dye into water. Through her daughters, her granddaughters, her scattered descendants, the marrow of her will spread. Her granddaughter Blanche of Castile rose like a blade unsheathed, becoming Queen of France, then regent for her son Louis IX. Blanche ruled with a precision and coldness that startled even hardened barons. She broke rebellions, negotiated treaties, and carved France into the most stable realm in Europe. Chroniclers said she had her great-grandmother's eyes, bright as molten gold, and her voice like iron wrapped in silk. In Blanche, Eleanor's fire lived on, ironic and perfect, that her blood would crown the throne of the man who had destroyed her world. Even England bore her ghost in its bones. The legal machinery Henry had built under her watch, the administrative web she had tightened during Richard's absences, outlived the men themselves. The chancery rolls, the exchequer ledgers, the circuit courts, all relics of her age, became the skeleton of English governance. The barons who cursed John still enforced laws she had midwifed. They did not speak her name when they did it, but her shadow curled silently beneath their words. She had made monarchy a structure, not just a man. Even as the men rotted, the structure remained. In Aquitaine, her old heartland, the troubadours still sang of her. They called her Eleanor la Grande, the Rose of Poitiers, the Queen of Two Realms, the Mother of Lions. They sang of her riding in gilded armor on the Second Crusade, of her dazzling courts where love songs were forged like weapons, of her iron defiance in Henry's dungeons, of the white-haired matriarch who had crossed Europe in winter to ransom her son. Time blurred the edges of the truth. She became larger than life, a creature half myth, half memory, her human flaws burned away by distance. No one remembered her arthritis or her loneliness. They remembered her fire. Even the church, which had once muttered against her pride, began to venerate her in whispers. Fontevraud Abbey, where her body lay, became a place of quiet pilgrimage. Pilgrims came to touch the carved stone of her hands, where she lay depicted with an open book, as if still reading the world she had shaped. They said the air around her effigy was colder than the rest of the nave, as if the stone remembered the force that had moved inside her flesh. Nuns told tales of seeing her ghost pacing the cloisters at night, veiled in white, pausing sometimes between Henry's and Richard's tombs, as if still judging which of them had failed her more. Her name outlived her empire because it was not tied to land or crown. It was tied to will. She had bent the age to herself. She had been the axis on which a century turned. The men who came after her were content to ride the currents of history. She had redirected them. And history, though it forgot her empire's borders, remembered the shape of her defiance. It remembered a woman who had ruled in a world that did not allow women to rule, who had raised kings and broken them, who had watched her sons devour each other and still walked forward through the smoke. Generations passed. Her direct line fractured, tangled, dissolved into the veins of dozens of royal houses. By the 14th century, nearly every throne in Western Europe could trace blood back to her. The Angevin Empire had become a footnote, but Eleanor had become a foundation. Her story was no longer just history. It was a fable told to princesses about what a woman could be if she dared to be more than what the world allowed. And still at Fontevraud, the cedars whispered. The wind slid through the cloisters where her steps had once struck like drumbeats. Moss crept across the stones but could not erase her name. The monks who swept the aisles each dawn would glance at her tomb as they passed and bow their heads slightly without knowing why. Something about her still demanded it. She had outlived her world. Now she outlived time. Her empire was dust. Her sons were ghosts. But the shape of her shadow remained, vast, echoing, indelible, as if the stones themselves remembered the woman who had once held up the sky. The world did not end when Eleanor of Aquitaine died. It simply became smaller. For half a century, she had been the hidden axis on which kingdoms turned. Queen of France, Queen of England, Duchess of Aquitaine, Mother of Kings, Maker of Storms. While she lived, the map of Europe had felt taut, stretched on invisible wires she alone could see, humming with her will. When she died, the wires slackened. The world sagged back into its ordinary shape, like a tent after the pole is pulled out. The men who followed her, John, Henry Tootheye, their sons and grandsons, wore her blood like a badge without understanding its weight. They clutched the remnants of her empire as if clutching heirlooms from a fire, not realizing they were holding ashes. The grandeur of the Angevin dream, the vast mosaic she had built with Henry and defended through Richard, shattered like a dropped mirror. Its shards lay scattered across the century. Normandy lost, Anjou lost, Aquitaine slipping inch by inch into French hands. By the time her great-grandson Edward I tried to revive it, the world she had made was as unreachable as Atlantis. And yet she remained everywhere, not in flesh or crown, but in ghost-like echoes, traces in the architecture of power, in the marrow of dynasties, in the very idea of what a woman could be. Even as her lands crumbled, her legend rose. The chroniclers who had once cursed her pride now wrote of her with awe, as if she had been some elemental force that passed briefly through mortal shape. They wrote of her riding to Antioch like a goddess of war, of her dazzling court in Poitiers, where love was forged into politics, of her iron defiance in Henry's dungeons, of her white-haired march across Europe to ransom Richard. They painted her not as a woman, but as a myth in human skin, a figure who had stepped out of time to alter its course. It was a comforting lie. The truth was sharper. Eleanor had not been born a myth. She had been born a girl in a cold stone keep, heir to Aquitaine, a child taught that crowns were cages unless you made them into weapons. She had survived 2 husbands, 8 children, 5 sons' rebellions, 1 empire's birth, and another's death. She had ruled by patience where Henry ruled by fury and Richard by fire. She had not been invincible. She had simply refused to break, and that refusal was what the world remembered. Not her beauty, though she had been famed for it. Not her wealth, though it had eclipsed kings. What endured was the silence inside her will, the place where doubt should have lived and did not. She had walked through her age like a blade through silk, leaving a clean line behind her, impossible to follow and impossible to erase. Richard was the brightest flare in her storm, and his brightness consumed him. He had carried her ambition like a torch through dry forests, setting everything ablaze. He had been her triumph and her sorrow, the boy she raised in gardens of song, who became a weapon she could no longer hold. He burned through his life in a blaze of sieges and crusades, and left nothing behind but a legend and an empty throne. She outlived him by 5 years. It felt like 5 centuries. She once told a confidant near the end that surviving him was like standing on the shore after the sea is gone. She had given him the world, and he had set it on fire. And when the fire died, there was only her, old, brittle, walking through the smoke, gathering what ashes could be saved. That was the paradox of her life. Power had been her gift and her curse. She had sought it not for glory, but for survival, yet it had devoured everything she loved. It had crushed her marriage, set her sons against each other, drowned her family in suspicion and blood. It had left her alone in the end, surrounded by thrones and graves. She had ruled so long that there was no one left to remember what she had been before she ruled. Even her tenderness, the warmth she had once poured into her children, had calcified into strategy. By the time she laid Richard in the earth, she was less mother than monument. But monuments cannot love. They can only endure. And endure she did. Longer than Henry, longer than Richard, longer than any of the men who thought themselves the center of her world. When they roared, she stood silent. When they fell, she still stood. When she finally lay down in the stone womb of Fontevraud, it was not in defeat but in exhaustion. She had carried the weight of a century on her shoulders, and even marble eventually cracks. Now her tomb lies between Henry's and Richard's in the dim nave, their stone faces frozen in that strange medieval calm, as if death had finally made them docile. Her effigy shows her reclining with a book open on her chest, as though she is still reading. Pilgrims say the air around her feels colder, that sound dulls when you stand near her, as if the world itself steps lightly in her presence. They say she looks asleep, not dead. They are wrong. She is gone, utterly. What remains is not her, only the hollow she carved in the world, a hollow so deep that 8 centuries later, the world still fits inside its shape. The Angevin Empire is long dust. Its borders survive only in footnotes and museum maps, its castles softened to ruins by ivy and rain. The men who once strutted through her life as if they owned it are names carved on fading stones. But her shadow is still here. It moves in the marrow of Europe, in the laws she set in motion, in the blood of kings who do not know her name, in the idea that power can be seized rather than inherited. It moves in the imaginations of those who whisper her story, the girl who became a duchess, who became a queen, who became the mother of lions and outlived them all. She proved in an age that believed women could only adorn history, that a woman could bend history instead. And she proved something darker, that bending it leaves nothing else to hold. In the end, that is the shape of her legacy, not the empire, not the titles, not the tomb, but the silence that followed her, vast and echoing, like the stillness after a storm. Eleanor of Aquitaine had carried an empire on her shoulders until her bones cracked, had given her son the world, and watched him set it aflame. And when the fire was gone, she walked alone through the ashes and left only her shadow behind. The world moved on, but it has never escaped her.